Dead America. Tales of the First Month. The Carpool. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Lexington, Kentucky. The morning of day 0. Malcolm staggered through the hallway of his modest suburban house, his brain still foggy with sleep as he struggled to wake up. The only thought on his mind had been coffee, his lone hope for shaking off the morning's sluggishness. But much to his misfortune, he had been mistaken in his thoughts. His sock-covered foot landed on a small toy left in the hallway, sending a jolt of pain shooting through his body. He managed to stifle a scream, resorting instead to a series of muffled curses muttered under his breath. It took him a moment to gather himself before he could continue his journey to the kitchen. Normally, at this hour, his wife of 20 years would have had coffee and breakfast ready. However, with her and their 2 young children down with a nasty cold, he was left to fend for himself. Malcolm stared at the coffee maker, noticing the remnants of yesterday's brew still lingering at the bottom of the container. As he opened the top to insert a new filter, he recoiled. The old one was still inside, with light mold beginning to form on top. "Jesus Marie," he muttered aloud. "Did you really just reuse the one from the other day?" He stared at the moldy filter for a moment, running his frustrated fingers through what was left of the hair on his head. After several moments of contemplation, he turned his attention to the refrigerator, grabbing a sugary energy drink, and slammed the door shut. As he cracked it open, he could almost hear his wife's voice in the back of his mind, even though she was still sound asleep on the other side of the house. Yeah, I know, Marie," he continued aloud. "These things aren't good for me. But if I don't wake up, I'm not going to survive the day." He chugged the entire drink in one go, convulsing a little as the caffeine coursed through his veins. "Oh yeah, that's the stuff," he muttered. Malcolm walked toward the door, grabbing the keys off the hook, and paused briefly to look in the mirror beside it. He let out a sigh at the sight before him. Jesus, man, where did it all go wrong? Mid-40s, boring-ass bank job, married with 2 kids, and the last time you felt the will to live was a decade ago. His pity party continued for several moments before his phone alarm began to blare. He sighed as he pulled it out, inspecting the message that read Carpool. Even though he wasn't thrilled it was his day, a slight smile crept onto his lips. Today's going to suck, but at least I get to see Daisy. Knowing his mood wasn't going to improve by staying inside the house, he stepped out into the world. While he didn't have much joy left in his life, his car was one of the few bright spots. Less than a year old, with way more power than anyone working in the city should need, it was the closest thing he'd ever owned to a sports car while his wife was still in the picture. He sat behind the steering wheel for several moments, breathing in the faint scent of new car smell that still lingered. The moment of silence didn't last long as his alarm went off again. "Yeah, I'm on my way," he grumbled. "Damn phone. I swear I'm going to chuck it over a bridge one of these days." With a begrudging sigh, he started the car and began driving the 3 blocks through the neighborhood to his first stop. Right on cue, he spotted Keith waving at him from the edge of his driveway. Like Malcolm, Keith was nearly on the wrong side of 40, with a wife and kid. Unlike Malcolm, Keith loved his life and was always talking about how great he had it, much to Malcolm's dismay. With a long, drawn-out sigh, Malcolm pulled over to the side of the road to let his coworker in. "Morning, Malcolm," Keith greeted cheerfully. "It's another beautiful day out, isn't it?" "My wife and kids are sick," Malcolm replied, his voice flat. "There's toys and germs overtaking my house, and I need a new coffee maker. The only thing beautiful about today is that I'm 17 minutes closer to it being over." "Well, you are a grumpy Gus today, aren't you?" Keith said, still trying to keep the mood light. Malcolm stared at the upbeat man with enough disdain to get Keith to quiet down. So Keith continued after a moment, "What do you say we find something on the radio?" Before Malcolm could respond, Keith had already switched on the radio, tuning it to the news station. Within seconds, a monotone voice filled the car, speaking in a serious tone. "We are still waiting on our field team to get to the hospital, where there have been reports of violence. We have reached out to the police, who have yet to respond." Abruptly, Malcolm changed the channel, and upbeat music from the 1980s filled the car. A small smile appeared on Malcolm's face, as if he were remembering something good from his younger days. "Why did you change the channel?" Keith asked. Because it's too early in the morning for more depressing news, Keith, Malcolm replied. There's never anything good happening in the world, and on those rare occasions when there is, it's never for you. Wow, Malcolm, Keith said. Why don't you tell me how you really feel? Malcolm let out a sigh, realizing he might have been a little harsh, but rather than apologize, he kept quiet, knowing that the silence would eat at Keith. Keith, instead of changing it back to the news, sat back in his seat, looking out the window at the world as it went by. Within a few moments, they were slowing down again to pick up the final two carpool members, Johnny and Daisy. As he slowed down, Malcolm's eyes were drawn to Daisy. She was in her early 20s, perky, fit, and blonde, everything Malcolm wished he had in a woman. He wasn't shy about sharing his admiration for her, either, often voicing it within earshot of anyone nearby. My God, he muttered. That is one gorgeous woman. Really, Malcolm? Keith replied with a hint of disgust. She's young enough to be your daughter. And I'm old enough to be her daddy, Malcolm shot back, grinning. Keith looked confused by the statement for a moment, then let out a gagging noise as he realized what Malcolm meant. Despite the disgusting remark, Keith bit his tongue, knowing Malcolm's seniority at the bank meant complaining would only make his life harder. Malcolm pulled up to the curb, and Daisy's geeky 20-year-old friend, Johnny, opened the door for her. As she slid into the back seat, Malcolm adjusted the rearview mirror to get a good look at her. Normally, this was the best part of Malcolm's week, but today some of the luster was lost as she began coughing repeatedly upon entering. Her coughing continued for several moments as Johnny came around the other side of the car and got in. Are you okay, Daisy? Johnny asked, concern in his voice. It took her a moment to compose herself. Yeah, I'm okay, Johnny, she finally replied. I've been like that all night. Why don't you just stay home then? Johnny suggested. You clearly need the rest. Before Daisy could answer, another coughing fit overcame her, allowing Malcolm to interject. She did try to call out last night, but unfortunately, her department is in a bit of a crunch, so she couldn't be spared. Malcolm let those words hang in the air, his thoughts taking a more lewd turn. Plus, there's no way I'm going to allow all you underlings into my car if I don't get to sneak peeks at that hot young thing. He continued staring at her in the rearview mirror, his gaze filled with his own inappropriate thoughts. I don't care if you're sick, girl, he thought to himself. You're still the hottest thing I've laid my eyes on. Daisy continued coughing as Johnny tended to her. Meanwhile, Keith noticed Malcolm leering at her in the mirror and cleared his throat to get his attention. Right, Malcolm muttered, snapping back to reality. Let's head to the office. As they got underway, Daisy's coughing finally subsided. Johnny pulled out a bottle of water, handing it over to her before turning his attention to the men in the front. Hey, have they had any more reports about the hospital? Keith shook his head. We heard a little bit about it on the radio before Malcolm changed it. Well, can we please turn it back? Johnny asked, his tone anxious. Nope, no can do, Johnny, Malcolm said firmly. But my wife works up there and... Johnny began, his voice tinged with worry. Malcolm cut him off. Then call her and see if she's okay. Besides, I'm sure it's nothing. You know how the media is, always wanting to sensationalize everything to keep you tuned in for ratings. Keith glanced back at Johnny, giving him an apologetic nod. While he was worried, Johnny knew they'd be at the office in 15 minutes and could check on his wife then. The car fell silent, save for the 80s music and Daisy's occasional cough. As they approached a business district with a couple of coffee shops, Malcolm, feeling the lingering effects of the energy drink, but still craving the warmth of Java, decided on an unscheduled stop. We're taking a bit of a detour, he announced. I'm going to hit the coffee shop up here on the right. I thought we were on crunch time? Keith asked. Stopping for coffee is going to make us late, isn't it? Malcolm considered for a moment, then shot a sly smile at Keith. If we're late, then we're late. But I figured Daisy could use some hot tea to soothe her throat from all that coughing. He adjusted his gaze to the rearview mirror, catching another look at Daisy. Despite being repulsed by the older banker, Daisy just smiled and nodded, knowing it was easier to go along than fight. A little green tea sound okay? Malcolm asked. Yes. Thank you, Daisy replied. keeping her answers short to avoid giving him an opening to continue talking. Malcolm reached the coffee shop's driveway and pulled into the line. 3 cars were ahead of them, and several people lounged on the front patio, most of them business people, oblivious to the outside world. The line moved slowly, and the car inched closer to the menu board. "You know what?" Malcolm said. "I'm feeling generous this morning. What do you 2 boys want?" Johnny perked up. "A double whip, half-calf 4-pump mocha on ice." Malcolm turned around, giving Johnny a look that made the young man rethink his order. "A large black coffee would be great, Malcolm," Johnny amended. "I can handle that," Malcolm replied. He glanced at Keith, who had his own complicated order in mind but shrugged it off under Malcolm's stare. "Large black coffee," Keith conceded. "Okay, 2 large black coffees and some green tea," Malcolm confirmed. "This is going to be a quick pit stop." Before the car could move up further, the screeching of tires caught their attention. All 4 occupants turned to see a sedan speeding down the street with someone clinging to the hood. "What in the hell?" Johnny exclaimed. The car swerved violently, trying to shake off the person clinging to its hood. It didn't slow down as it jumped the curb, landing hard on the parking lot pavement before slamming into the patio. Bodies scattered. Some people dove out of the way just in time, while others were struck and flung into the air. A few unlucky souls were trapped beneath the car. Without hesitation, Johnny threw open his door, shouting, "Keith, call 911. Chapter 2. Malcolm stared at the wreckage in front of the coffee shop as people screamed and panicked, his mind dazed from the shock of it all. Everything seemed to slow down to a crawl. 2 people rushed out of the coffee shop, heading straight toward the car where 2 others were pinned underneath. One woman, her cell phone still in her hand, reached out for help as the tire crushed her chest. 3 people picked themselves up off the ground, pushing an overturned metal table off of themselves. One man in a business suit bled profusely from his head, while the other 2 stood there in a daze. Eventually, they turned their attention toward each other, checking to make sure they were all right. After several tense moments, one of them pointed a few yards to their right. The front window of the coffee shop was cracked, as if something large and heavy had smashed into it. Malcolm looked at the hood of the car, noticing that the man who had been clinging to it was now missing. It didn't take him long to figure out that whoever had been going for a ride was the one who had flown into the window. Malcolm turned his attention back to the trio of businessmen who were walking toward where the mystery man had presumably fallen. From his vantage point, it was hard to tell what was happening, but Malcolm watched as one of the men was grabbed by the belt and pulled down to the ground. The man's friend tried to help, only to scream and run in the other direction. He grabbed his bloodied coworker, dragging him away from the scene. Malcolm continued to stare, confused by what he was witnessing. As he watched, zoning out, he was brought back to the moment by Johnny yelling. "Keith, call 911, Johnny shouted. Keith, like Malcolm, was transfixed by the scene on the patio. After another bout of yelling from Johnny, he finally pulled out his cell phone. "Yeah, I'm going to call right now," Keith muttered, fumbling with his phone, his hands shaking from fear and shock. Knowing that the call was being made, Johnny turned to assist the others on the patio. But before he could take a step, Malcolm spoke up in a forceful tone. "Johnny, get back in the car." Johnny shook his head. "I'm going to go help them, Malcolm." "Just get your ass back in the car," Malcolm ordered. Daisy chimed in, her voice weak and trailing off into a coughing fit. "Yeah, Johnny, there are plenty of people there helping." Johnny's tone grew almost angry. "I can't believe you people. I'm going to go help." "Get your ass in this car," Malcolm snapped. "To hell with you, Malcolm," Johnny retorted. He turned and rushed toward the patio, joining a few others who were struggling to move the car off the trapped patrons. "Damn it," Keith muttered. "What is it?" Daisy asked. 911. "Nobody is answering," Keith replied. "How can that be?" Daisy demanded. "I don't know," Keith said, frustration creeping into his voice. "It's not even ringing, it's just making this weird sound." He hit dial again, holding up the phone so Daisy could hear the strange tones coming through. While they were engaged with that, Malcolm's gaze remained fixed on the patio, staring right where the businessman had been pulled down. Nobody seemed to be paying attention to the car hood rider or the fallen man, most of them having their backs turned. None of them saw when one of them slowly stood up, taking a moment to steady itself. Once it was steady, the creature acted quickly, running through an overturned table and wrapping its arms around one of the helpers by the car. The man let out a scream as the ghoul latched onto his shoulder with its teeth. Several of the others watched in horror as flesh was ripped from bone. The wounded man, with adrenaline pumping through him, managed to turn and shove the zombie away. The creature stumbled backward, tripping over an overturned chair and slamming to the ground. As it struggled to get back to its feet, the bitten businessman reanimated, standing up and immediately turning his attention toward the people by the car, who were now acutely aware that something was horribly wrong on the patio. Malcolm turned his attention away from the carnage unfolding by the wreckage, reaching over to the glove box, only to find it locked. "Damn it," he muttered, turning the car off, sliding the key into the lock, and unlatching the glove box. He reached inside, throwing out papers and a collection of fast food napkins so he could reach all the way to the back. "There you are," he said, retracting his hand, revealing a .38 revolver. He held it up for the others to see. "Why do you have a gun?" Daisy asked. "Forget that," Keith interjected. "What do you plan on doing with that gun?" "There's something wrong on that patio and I'm going to sort it out," Malcolm replied. "Now get the car started up again." "But Malcolm..." Keith began. Malcolm flung open his door, looking back at Keith and yelling as loud as his lungs would allow, "Just do it. God damn it." Keith and Daisy were both taken aback by his tone. Daisy tried to speak up but went into a severe coughing fit. At first, Keith ignored it, but when she spit up blood onto herself, his concern for Malcolm's actions went out the window. "My God, Daisy," Keith exclaimed. Malcolm ignored what was happening in the car, stepping out into the parking lot and checking the weapon to make sure each cylinder had a round chambered. Once he was certain, he turned his attention to the patio, which had turned into a full-on brawl. A couple of people were fighting the zombies hand-to-hand, throwing punches as the ghouls ran in for the kill. One man landed a clean punch to the bridge of a creature's nose, snapping it in two but doing nothing to stop its momentum. The creature slammed into the man with enough force to drive them back onto the hood of the car. The businessman struggled with the ghoul, letting out a scream as it took a chunk out of his arm. Malcolm looked around, finally spotting Johnny, who had his arm wrapped around the neck of a zombie attacking a young woman. The creature thrashed about, smacking the woman in the face as she pushed it away, aided by Johnny's pulling. It took their combined effort to free the young woman from its grasp. The creature let out a dissatisfied moan as it watched its prey slip away, only to have its attention immediately shift toward Johnny. The creature flailed around frantically, breaking free of the young man's grasp before grabbing onto him. "Help me, help me," Johnny cried out. Johnny looked over the zombie's shoulder as he struggled to keep it at bay, only to see the young woman he had risked his life to help running across the street. "Damn it," Johnny shouted. Johnny and the creature struggled for a tense moment, with the young banker trying to grab onto the zombie's arms to prevent it from grabbing him. Unfortunately, the zombie was undeterred, managing to latch onto Johnny's wrist and pull his arm closer. Johnny watched helplessly as the ghoul sunk its teeth into his forearm. A pained scream escaped his lips as the flesh from his arm was ripped free, trapped in the teeth of the horrific creature. Johnny screamed again, trying to summon the strength to break free. He managed to drive the creature backward, shoving it away just enough for it to trip over a chair and fall back onto a table. The ghoul didn't hit the ground, however, and quickly recovered, locking onto the wounded banker. Johnny tried to get into a defensive position as the ghoul charged toward him. Before it could attack again, a shot rang out, the bullet hitting the zombie in the chest. The bullet didn't slow down the creature, but it did divert its attention toward Malcolm, who was standing 10 yards away in the parking lot. "Yeah, I'm over here, asshole," Malcolm taunted. Malcolm aimed again, squeezing the trigger and sending another round toward the ghoul, hitting it in the chest again. He stared, bewildered, as the zombie wasn't fazed by the gunshot. Terror crept up his spine as the ghoul began running straight for him. "What in the hell?" Malcolm muttered, firing again, hitting the zombie in the chest, which did nothing to slow it down as it closed the distance. In a last-ditch effort, Malcolm adjusted his aim toward the zombie's head, pulling the trigger and hoping his aim was true. Much to his relief, the bullet found its mark, ripping through the forehead of the ghoul. The creature's momentum carried it another step before falling to the ground, just a few yards away from the terrified banker. "Thank you, Malcolm," Johnny gasped, taking a step toward Malcolm, who quickly adjusted his aim toward the young man, forcing him to stop. "What are you doing? We have to get out of here," Johnny pleaded, motioning to the fight going on behind him. There were only a handful of survivors left on the patio, and they were all grappling with attacking zombies. Malcolm knew it was only a matter of seconds before they noticed they were standing there. "I told you to stay in the car, man. I told you," Malcolm said, beginning to back up slowly toward the car. Johnny tried to match his pace, but before he could take a second step, Malcolm fired a shot into the ground right at his feet, forcing him to stop. "What the hell, Malcolm?" Johnny yelled. Malcolm's expression hardened, his grip on the gun unwavering. "I'm sorry, Johnny, but I'm not taking any chances with those bites. Once the police get here and take you to the hospital, give me a call, and I'll come pick you up. But you're not getting back in my car before that." Johnny's voice cracked as he pleaded, desperation edging his words. "Please, man, please." Malcolm shook his head, resolute, and turned, running back to the car. He slammed the door shut and threw it into drive. As they sped around the side of the drive-thru, Daisy's coughing fit intensified, her body racked with violent spasms. Keith began yelling at the top of his lungs. "What are you doing? You can't leave Johnny," Keith screamed. "He got bit by whatever those things are," Malcolm shot back, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. "He got attacked, and you're leaving him behind." Keith's voice was thick with disbelief and anger. "You're damn right I am. Something is not right," Malcolm shouted. Keith's eyes widened, his face flushed with rage. "Yeah, and you're leaving our friend behind." Malcolm swerved back onto the road, slamming on the brakes and pointing out the back window. "Something is not right back there. Look, everybody is attacking everybody." Keith turned, his gaze following Malcolm's pointing finger. He saw the chaos unfolding behind them. The people who had been holding off the attackers were now standing up, joining them in the assault. Both men watched helplessly as 3 of the ghouls broke away from a fallen victim, running straight toward Johnny. "Oh my God," Keith whispered, his face pale as he watched. Johnny never saw them coming. The ghouls tackled him to the ground from behind, going into a frenzy. They tore into his flesh, ripping out chunks as Johnny's body convulsed on the ground. "Jesus. Poor Johnny," Keith muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We gotta get moving," Malcolm insisted, his voice steely. He turned his attention back to the front, shifting the car into drive, and began moving away from the coffee shop carnage. Chapter 3. Malcolm sped down the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he maneuvered away from the coffee shop. Keith sat beside him, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, unable to look away from the chaos they had just escaped. The image of his friend being devoured replayed in his mind, triggering a tidal wave of anger that surged from his stomach and burst out of him with a scream. He swung wildly at Malcolm, his fist connecting with the older man's shoulder. Malcolm jerked the wheel, swerving the car into oncoming traffic. "Keith, what the hell?" he yelled, his voice rising in panic. The headlights of a pickup truck loomed large in front of them, blindingly close. Keith pulled back, his outburst momentarily extinguished by the threat of the collision. Malcolm quickly corrected their path, wrenching the wheel back into their lane and slamming on the brakes. Both men lunged forward in their seats, held back only by their seatbelts. Malcolm's hand darted out, and with a backhanded slap, he struck Keith across the nose. The sound of the slap echoed in the confined space of the car, and Keith's head snapped back. A light crack reverberated through the air, but it wasn't enough to break his nose. Still, he knew he'd feel the sting of it in the morning, if they made it that far. Keith shouted, "What the hell, Malcolm?" "I could say the same of you." Malcolm shot back, "What in the hell are you hitting me for?" "You left Johnny back there to die." Keith's voice quivered with anger and disbelief. Malcolm didn't flinch. He made his bed, so I left him to lie in it. He was hurt, and you just left him. Keith's voice cracked, his hands clenched into fists. You're damn right I did. You saw what was happening on that patio. Are you telling me you would have let him back into the car? Malcolm demanded. Keith replayed the scene in his mind, the way the people who were attacked by those things had joined their ranks almost instantly. He shook his head, still unwilling to believe his own eyes. This is impossible, he muttered. There's nothing that causes people to go crazy that quickly. Rabies takes days. I don't think it's rabies, Malcolm replied, his tone steady. But hell, I don't really care what it is. I just know I don't want it anywhere near me. You still shouldn't have left him, Keith insisted, his voice growing softer, almost pleading. Malcolm shot him a cold look. Well, it's a good thing you're not in charge then, because you don't have to make the hard choices like that. Realizing he was getting nowhere, Keith turned slightly in his seat, his voice carrying into the back. Daisy, do you want to chime in here? No reply came from the back seat. After a long, tense silence, Keith turned around, his eyes widening at the sight of Daisy lying motionless. Blood stained her lips, and a small pool had formed on the seat beneath her. Oh my God, Daisy, he cried. Keith fumbled with his seatbelt, his hands shaking as he tried to climb into the back seat. Before he could get over the console, Malcolm grabbed him by the belt and yanked him back down. Put on your seatbelt, Malcolm ordered. I've got to get back there and help her, Keith protested. I said, put on your seatbelt, Malcolm repeated, his voice firm as he pointed out the windshield. Keith turned his gaze forward, and both men watched in horror as a chaotic scene unfolded. People were sprinting out of a nearby restaurant, their faces contorted with terror, as several creatures pursued them. Two of the fleeing patrons managed to make it across the street, but one was too slow. A speeding truck clipped him, sending him spinning before he crashed to the ground. One of the diners tried to help the fallen man, while the other bolted in the opposite direction. Malcolm and Keith watched, frozen in their seats, as the creatures overtook the two men, dragging them down and beginning their gruesome attack. Malcolm broke the silence. Reload this, he said, handing Keith the .38 handgun. There are more bullets in the back of the glove box. Keith took the gun, his hands still trembling, and began to reload. Where are we going? He asked, his voice tight with fear. Malcolm kept his eyes fixed on the scene outside. With what's going on, I don't think we should be going into the office. Agreed, Keith nodded. Far too many people to deal with. But where can we go that's safe? Malcolm seemed lost in thought for a moment, then said, the main branch. Keith frowned. The main branch? But it's closed for remodeling, isn't it? It is, Malcolm replied, a small grin forming on his lips. But guess who was supposed to take a group of investors over there for a tour today? He pulled a set of keys from his pocket and dangled them in front of Keith. Keith's eyes lit up with hope. I don't suppose there was going to be food at this function, was there? Just some light snacks, Malcolm said, but there's enough food and water to last us a few days. Plus, that building is built like a fortress. You gotta love the old buildings, Keith murmured, a faint smile playing on his lips. Yes, you do, Malcolm agreed. But what do we do about Daisy? Keith asked, his smile fading. She probably needs a doctor. We get her inside and hope she starts getting better, Malcolm replied. Keith wasn't satisfied with that answer, but he knew Malcolm was right. If this was happening out here, the hospital was likely overrun. And if by some miracle it wasn't, it would surely be swamped with patients. Okay, Malcolm said, his tone shifting to one of urgency. Make sure that seat belt is tight because I'm not slowing down for anything. I'll keep trying 911 too, Keith muttered, pulling out his phone. Whatever keeps you from throwing punches at me, Malcolm grumbled. Sorry about that. Keith trailed off, struggling to find the words. Save it, Malcolm cut him off. You'll have plenty of time to kiss my ass once we're safe. Keith huffed and dialed the emergency line on his phone as Malcolm pressed the gas pedal, the sedan surging forward. They raced through the streets, swerving to avoid people who darted out in front of them. Malcolm yanked up the emergency brake, cutting the wheel sharply to the right, sending Keith sliding in his seat. Daisy was tossed around in the back, her body limp and lifeless. Once they were facing the right direction again, Malcolm released the brake and accelerated. The car sped away from the business district, heading toward a quieter area near the park. Despite the narrow streets, Malcolm kept the pedal to the floor, pushing the car to 70 miles an hour. Keith glanced out the window, catching only glimpses of the chaos around them. "Slow down, man. Slow down," he shouted. "I'm in control. We're good," Malcolm replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I said slow down," Keith repeated, his voice rising with fear. Malcolm tore his eyes from the road for a split second, shooting Keith a look of frustration. "I said that I'm in control, so shut your..." Before he could finish, a sudden impact jerked them all forward. Malcolm looked up to see blood spattered across the cracked windshield. Keith's voice trembled. "Oh my God, you hit someone." Malcolm didn't respond. He swerved sharply, turning up the next street. As they rounded the corner, Keith glanced back to see a jogger lying in the middle of the road, limbs bent at unnatural angles. He turned away just in time to see a female runner, now a zombie, racing toward the fallen man. Keith closed his eyes, not wanting to witness what was clearly about to happen. "I told you to slow down," he whispered. Malcolm said nothing but eased his foot off the gas, bringing them down to a more manageable speed. They weaved between a few stray zombies emerging from the park. After several tense moments, Malcolm finally spoke, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Was he one of those things? Keith paused, debating whether to tell Malcolm the truth or lash out in anger. His frustration simmered, but he realized that Malcolm held his life in his hands. With a resigned sigh, he muttered, "It was one of those things." Malcolm exhaled deeply, a mix of relief and regret in his voice. "That's good to know. I mean, even if that guy wasn't one of those things, he was still cooked if he was out in all this wearing just running shorts. But I'm glad to know it wasn't me that killed him." "Thank God for small miracles, huh?" Keith murmured. "Tell me about it," Malcolm agreed, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Keith tried to push the images of the dying man from his mind, turning his attention to the quiet streets around them. "How much further to the main branch?" he asked. "A couple of miles," Malcolm replied. "But I think I can get us most of the way there through the back roads." "Good," Keith nodded. "The fewer people around, the safer I'll feel." "Agreed," Malcolm said. "But we'll have to go through a busy area to get there. No way around it." "How big of an area?" Keith asked. "Half a mile or so," Malcolm admitted. "Jesus Christ," Keith whispered. "Yeah, I know," Malcolm said, his tone grim. "There's a supercenter, a couple of grocery stores, and a bunch of fast food places. I'm hoping if there's anybody there, they'll be focused on those big stores." "And if they're not?" Keith asked. "Then at least we know my car can plow through some of those things and keep rolling," Malcolm replied. Keith bit back a retort, deciding not to bring up the dead jogger again. Silence fell between them, punctuated only by the occasional scream or the sight of a zombie shuffling through a yard. After half a mile, they heard movement from the back seat. Malcolm glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of Daisy. Her head was down, her hair falling over her face. "It's good to see you up, Daisy," Malcolm said, trying to sound cheerful. "Are you feeling any better after that nap?" Keith turned, hopeful. "I have a bottle of water in my bag if you..." His words died in his throat as Daisy looked up. The light in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dark, empty void. "Oh my God, Daisy," Keith gasped. Before Malcolm could react, Daisy let out a low, guttural moan and lunged forward, her hands clawing for the men in the front seat. Chapter 4. Keith let out a scream as the zombified Daisy lunged at him from the back seat. Her excited moans filled the car, her arms flailing about, trying to grab any piece of warm flesh they could. Keith tried to unbuckle his seatbelt to give himself a freer range of motion, but it was stuck. Despite his best efforts, he only managed to turn halfway around in his seat. A surge of panic shot through him as he felt one of her hands grab onto his wrist. He yanked his arm, trying to break free, but her grip was too tight. She pulled it closer toward her gaping maw, mere inches away from tearing out a chunk when she was suddenly flung to the passenger side of the car. Malcolm had cut the wheel hard while slamming on the brakes, sending Daisy bouncing around the back seat. His initial instinct was to stop so they could deal with the problem, but the noise from the screeching tires drew the attention of half a dozen ghouls around the neighborhood. Malcolm looked around, seeing the sprinting horde getting closer. Not wanting to risk the zombies getting through a window, he hit the gas, propelling them down the road. The constant speed changes caused Keith's seatbelt to pull tight, locking him into his seat. "I can't move," Keith shouted, his voice strained with panic. Malcolm didn't respond, his focus fully on the road ahead. Keith continued his attempts to free himself from the seatbelt, but it held firm. His struggle was interrupted by the zombie Daisy in the back seat, who had gathered herself for another attack. This time, she pulled herself halfway over the seat, grabbing onto Keith's lap belt with one hand and securing herself. Keith screamed as her teeth found the top of his ear, ripping it clean off. "She bit me. She bit me," Keith yelled in terror. Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his revolver and thrusting it toward Keith. "Hit her with this," he ordered. Keith hesitated, still clinging to the false hope that Daisy could somehow be saved if they could just get her help. But after several seconds of trying to keep her at bay, he aimed the handgun through the seat and pulled the trigger. The bullet ripped through the fabric and into her gut, but it did nothing to deter her attack. Her arms continued to flail, smacking Keith in the face and causing him to drop the handgun onto the driver's side floorboard. "Damn it, Keith," Malcolm cursed. He kept one hand on the wheel while using his other to punch at the creature, trying to break her grip on Keith's arm. His first few punches missed, but the next one connected, slamming into her wrist and shattering it. Even though she felt no pain, she lost the ability to grip with that hand, giving Keith the chance to shove her arm backward, allowing himself a brief respite. But the relief was short-lived. Daisy lunged again, vicious and well-aimed, biting directly into the side of Keith's neck where it connected to his shoulder. Keith let out a pained cry, shrieking and pleading with Daisy to let him go. Malcolm's voice was firm, almost resigned. "Oh, to hell with this." He sped up for a few seconds before slamming on the brakes. The sudden momentum change sent both men forward, held in place by their seatbelts. Daisy, however, flew over the front seat, landing headfirst on the floorboard at Keith's feet. As she thrashed about, Daisy managed to plant her teeth into Keith's calf, ripping out another large chunk of flesh and causing immense pain to the already wounded banker. Malcolm ignored Keith's plight, reaching down into the floorboard and feeling around for the revolver. After a few moments, he found it. "I'm sorry, girl. I really am," Malcolm said softly, raising the handgun to her head. He gave Daisy one last look before squeezing the trigger. At such close range, the bullet found its mark, ripping through her forehead. Both men's ears rang as she fell lifeless onto Keith's lap. Keith let out a primal scream as he finally managed to undo his seatbelt, frantically climbing into the back seat. Keith landed hard, pausing for a moment to compose himself before instinct took over. He grabbed a jacket from the back floorboard and pressed it over his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Malcolm let out a deep sigh, his eyes scanning around the car for any signs of other zombies. Relieved to see none, he threw the car into park. "What are you doing?" Keith asked, his voice strained. "I don't want her in the car with us," Malcolm replied, his tone matter of fact. Keith tried to protest, but the combination of pain and blood loss made it difficult. He watched helplessly as Malcolm got out of the car and casually walked to the passenger side. The entire event was brief and unceremonious. Just a quick door opening, grabbing the deceased Daisy by the back of the shirt and dragging her out to the pavement. As quickly as it had begun, it was over, and Malcolm was back in the car. He checked the mirrors again, ensuring no other zombies were approaching. To his relief, he saw none, though he knew that could change at any moment. Keith sat there, putting as much pressure on his neck wound as he could. The bites on his ear and leg bled profusely and would eventually need attention, but the neck wound was the most serious. Despite the bleeding, the bites weren't his biggest problem at the moment. "Keith, we've known each other a long time," Malcolm began, "so I'm going to give you two choices. I don't suppose one of those is going to the hospital, is it?" Keith replied. "I'm afraid not," Malcolm said. "You can't blame a guy for asking," Keith muttered. "No, you can't," Malcolm agreed. They sat in silence for a moment, Keith continuing his efforts to stem the flow of blood. The quiet grew heavy, and finally Keith couldn't bear it any longer. "Well, we don't really have a lot of time," Keith said, "so why don't you lay it out for me?" "I think we both know you're not long for this world," Malcolm said bluntly. "I'm willing to put you down mercifully if you want." Keith let out a horrified chuckle, shaking his head at the offer. "If that's what you're leading with, then how bad is your other offer?" Malcolm sighed. "My other offer is to let you out of the car right here. It looks like there's a nice swing on the porch over there. If you're lucky, you might get a few minutes of peace before you bleed out, or..." Malcolm's voice trailed off, and Keith picked up on what he was getting at. "Or I get eaten alive, again." Keith's emotions began to overwhelm him, tears forming in his eyes as frustrated screams tore from his throat. He didn't want to admit that this was the end, but in his heart, he knew it was. He sat there, stewing in his frustration, contemplating for what felt like an eternity. "If you don't decide, Keith," Malcolm said sharply, "I'm going to have to decide for you. I do have places to be." Keith let out a pained smile, shaking his head at Malcolm's audacity. "Really, Malcolm? This is literally the last decision I'm ever going to make in my life, and you're rushing." Before Keith could finish his sentence, a shot rang out from the front seat. The bullet pierced right through his heart, and a sharp pain shot through his body. Shock quickly took over, and the pain began to subside. Keith looked down at his bullet wound, watching the blood pour from his chest. He gritted his teeth and tried to speak, but before he could form words, what little life remained in his body escaped. Malcolm sat there for a moment, staring at his now deceased coworker. Despite just ending a man's life, Malcolm was remarkably calm. He wasn't sure if it was because Keith was as good as dead already, or if he simply didn't care about the man. Either way, his lack of remorse caused some worry in him. "If any therapist survives the day," Malcolm muttered, "I might need to schedule an appointment." Malcolm started to open the car door to rid himself of the corpse, but the sound of footsteps startled him. He looked out the window to see a zombie sprinting toward him. "Jesus Christ," he shouted. He slammed the door shut just as the ghoul reached the window, smacking into the glass and smearing blood on it. He stared for a moment, noticing that the ghoul was a little old lady. "Damn, even the grannies are deadly," he muttered. Malcolm threw the car into drive and peeled out, speeding down the residential street toward his refuge, which was getting closer with every block. Another half-mile down, he saw the outskirts of the business area, teeming with activity. Several cars were wrecked on the side of the road, and a couple more were involved in a major accident at the intersection. Stretched across the parking lots of the supercenter and grocery stores were dozens of creatures, running wild and chasing anyone unfortunate enough to be outside. "Okay, Malcolm, you got this," he whispered to himself. "Just get across that main street, another few blocks down, and you're home free." Malcolm gripped the wheel tightly, revving the engine a couple of times before putting the pedal to the metal. The car picked up speed rapidly, approaching the main road as his focus honed in. Just before reaching it, however, he heard movement coming from the back seat. Malcolm glanced into the rearview mirror and spotted a reanimated Keith, his eyes now clouded and lifeless, locking onto him with a ravenous hunger. "Oh my God." Malcolm gasped, letting off the gas as panic surged through him. He fumbled with the handgun, trying to aim it toward the back seat. His efforts were frantic and unfocused, and before he could line up the shot, the zombified Keith lunged at him, sinking his teeth deep into Malcolm's neck. Malcolm's scream was choked and wet, blood gurgling in his throat as Keith tore a chunk of flesh from his neck. Pain seared through him, but Malcolm was undeterred. He forced his hand to keep moving, raising the revolver with trembling fingers and jamming it into Keith's mouth. He adjusted his aim upward, feeling the cold metal of the barrel against the zombie's teeth, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, and the top of Keith's skull exploded outward, painting the car's interior with gore. Keith's body went slack, collapsing back into the seat, lifeless once more. With the immediate threat neutralized, Malcolm dropped the gun and clutched his neck, trying to stem the flow of blood. His entire hand was slick and hot, coated in crimson, and he knew from the force of the spurting blood that the bite had nicked an artery. He could feel his strength draining fast, his vision narrowing as black spots danced in front of his eyes. Within seconds, his body began to betray him, the loss of blood causing his limbs to feel heavy and unresponsive. His foot slipped from the brake and flopped onto the gas pedal, pressing it down with his fading strength. The car lurched forward, accelerating wildly toward the main road. Malcolm's hands were still on the wheel, but they lacked the coordination to steer properly. The vehicle swerved dangerously, narrowly missing a few parked cars and a lamppost before barreling down the street. His vision was growing darker by the second, the edges blurring as the world seemed to tilt and spin around him. The outlines of buildings and trees blurred together, but in his last moments of clarity, Malcolm saw the shape of a fast food restaurant looming ahead. It was close, too close, and he realized with a cold, sinking dread that he had no control left. His body was shutting down. He could barely feel his arms or legs. The pain in his neck had become a distant, dull throb, his consciousness slipping further and further away. Malcolm's final thought, as the car hurtled toward the restaurant's front entrance, was not of fear or regret, but a strange, detached curiosity about what might come next. He couldn't hear the crunch of metal or the shatter of glass as the car crashed through the windows, plowing into tables and chairs with a violent force. He couldn't feel the impact as the vehicle collided with the far wall, the airbags deploying with a muted thud. All he felt was a fleeting, cold embrace of darkness as it closed in around him, the sounds of the world fading to nothing. And then there was silence. The end.